Neuroscientist Marianne Wolf describes how the human brain learned to read only a few thousand years ago, and how reading has changed the way our brains work. Her talk from the Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts, is an hour 10 minutes.
Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Harvard Coop. You know, one of the pioneers of the French Surrealist movement described the surreal as being the chance encounter of an umbrella and a sewing machine on a dissecting table. Well, I have to wonder what he would have thought about the premeditated encounter of Proust and a squid, of all things, on the title of a book. I mean, Jules Verne and a squid, well, that's an obvious couple to find at the dance, right? But what, his often tentacularly entangling sentences aside, has Proust got to do with a beast of the deep? Well, that is a secret I will leave to tonight's guest to reveal. What is no longer a secret, after just a few days following its publication, is that behind Marianne Wolf's grabber of a title is a grabber of a book. Now, you know that some music begins with a lot of orchestral scene setting and throat cleaning and kind of slow muttering, marshalling of forces, and some begins with a cymbal crash. You might nod off later, but for the moment you sit up straight, all is, right? Well, Proust and the Squid starts off with just such a bang. A whole paragraph of bangs, actually. Marianne's way of serving notice, I think, that she has something to say, and a good deal to say, and no time to beat around the bush in saying it. And in this case, the pace never slackens, and no, you won't nod off. If you never thought that reading about reading was your cup of tea, well, you may find that the way Marianne serves it up, it's not weak tea, but a pretty heady brew. Now, you take a look back yonder in the store, and you'll see that our once very modest cognitive science section is now bursting at the seams, full of itself, and ready to invade and colonize the shelf space of its nearest neighbors. The brain is big. Now, let others argue whether it's sexy to be brainy, but the brain itself, as a subject, is sexier than ever. All brains. If you read the Globe's review of Marianne's book yesterday, you probably also read a few pages earlier an article about the behavior of birds. Because yes, even bird brains, a term better used, it now seems, as a compliment than as a pejorative, are sexy today. You would think that with all the eons we've had in which to get used to it, the gray matter under our hats would be old hat by now. But these old brains of ours are like brand new toys, and boy, is it fun to learn how they work. Now, the mad scientists in the old Frankenstein movies were always feverishly looking for brains. But today's sane scientists, we'll be generous and give them the benefit of the doubt, are just as feverishly looking at them and finding out as much about our inner universe at long last as, thanks to the Hubble telescope, we are finding out at long last about the outer one. And Marianne, in her groundbreaking look at our reading brains, our evolving brains, brings whole cerebral galaxies dazzlingly to light. Marianne Wolf comes to us tonight all the way from down the street, 2 T-stops away, actually, where she is professor of child development and director for the Center of Reading and Language Research at Tufts, and where she holds the John DiBiagio Chair of Citizenship and Public Service. Her new book is a public service, and as a book about the delights of reading should be a true reading delight itself. This is science not as vegetables, this is science as dessert. Well, it's no less a delight to have Marianne join us here, so please now join me in giving her, on this brisk evening, a very warm welcome.
You can always tell when you are in the company of a true book lover. That was the introduction of a true one. Thank you so much, Richard. I want to first just thank everybody for coming. Some of you are dear, dear friends, and some of you are such new friends. It's a baby that I've never met from MIT, a dear friend's baby, so I'm just thrilled. What I'm going to do tonight is actually read to you, believe it or not. And I will inevitably step outside the book and talk to you about some of my thoughts. But I want to read to you certain sections because the book is in sections. And sometimes I feel like I just want you to do all the reading and me just to sit there and ask you questions. Because in fact, Richard, that's what Proust is really all about. And I'm going to read to you a section about Proust in just a minute, but lest there be too much of a mystery, Proust wrote a tiny little book called On Reading. And this book was given to me by one of the dearest people, the grande dame, really, of reading research is Jean Chaw, who taught at the Harvard Reading Lab. And she gave me this book. She isn't alive today, but I will just dedicate tonight's whole wonderful experience to the memory of Jean Chaw. And in this book, Proust said something that I'm going to read to you, actually, to begin with. We feel quite truly that our wisdom begins where that of the author ends. And we would like to have him or her give us answers, while all he can do is give us desires. By a law which perhaps signifies that we can receive the truth from nobody, and that we must create it ourselves, that which is the end of their wisdom appears to us as but the beginning of ours. And that, gentle readers, is truly the heart of reading. And that is the reason why the very first word of the book is a reference to going beyond print itself through Proust. I want to begin, however, not with the symbols and the clash of the first chapter, which I will read a little bit from, but a quieter mood. And it's a bit of the preface. And I do not want that baby to leave. I want my time in Harvard Square to be with that beautiful child. Because that's where it begins. That is going to be a genius baby, already going to book signings and book readings. That's our blessing. I have lived my life in the service of words, finding where they hide in the convoluted recesses of the brain, studying their layers of meaning and form, and teaching their secrets to the young. In these pages, I invite you to ponder the profoundly creative quality at the heart of reading words. Nothing in our intellectual development should be less taken for granted at this moment in history as the transition to a digital culture accelerates its pace. This is particularly true because there also has never been a time when the complex beauty of the reading process stood more revealed, when the magnitude of its contributions was more clearly understood by science, or when these contributions seemed more in danger of being replaced by new forms of communication. Examining what we have and reflecting on what we want to preserve are the leitmotifs of these pages. In this book, I hope to push you gently towards reconsidering things you might have long taken for granted, such as how natural it seems for a child to learn to read. In the evolution of our brain's capacity to learn, the act of reading is not natural, with consequences both marvelous and tragic for many people, particularly children. Oddly enough, a preface often presents the author's final thoughts on finishing the book, and this book is no exception. But rather than end with my own words, I wish to use those that I know Richard knows. I know this. I have never met you, but I will bet. They come from the gentle curator, Marilyn Robinson's book, Gilead. And this is what he said to his son when he gave his own best writings. I wrote almost all of it in the deepest hope and conviction, sifting my thoughts and choosing my words, trying to say what was true. And I'll tell you frankly, that was wonderful. That's really how I feel about the whole book. And my dear people from the Center for Reading and Language Research and MIT's lab, who are my dear colleagues, they know that's true. And they know books take a long time. Books are our friends. And I told Richard before I came that coming to the Harvard Coop on this side is a wonderful thing. Going to all the bookstores around New England is something very special. And I just want to tell you that it makes me so wonderful to put one more friend of ours on the shelf. Because these books are friends. They are our relatives. And I don't want you, as you hear me talk or as you read, I look at Juliana and I think of the MIT lab as we look at the brain images. I don't want you to forget what it feels like to read. And that's what bookstores do so beautifully for all of us. And now I'm going to begin with the symbols. Chapter 1, sentence 1. We were never born to read. This is what Richard was referring to. Human beings invented reading only a few thousand years ago. And with this invention, we rearranged the very organization of our brain, which in turn expanded the ways we were able to think, which altered the intellectual evolution of our species. Reading is one of the single most remarkable inventions in history. The ability to record history is one of its consequences. Our ancestors' invention could come about only because of the human brain's extraordinary ability to make new connections among its existing structures, a process made possible by the brain's ability to be shaped by experience. This plasticity at the heart of the brain's design forms the basis for much of who we are, but also who we might become. This book tells the story of the reading brain in the context of our unfolding intellectual evolution. That story is changing before our eyes and under the tips of our fingers. The next few decades, the next few years, will witness transformations in our ability to communicate as we recruit new connections in the brain that will propel our intellectual development in new and different ways. Knowing what reading demands of our brain and knowing how it contributes to our capacity to think, to feel, to infer, and to understand other human beings is especially important today as we make the transition from a reading brain to an increasingly digital one. By coming to understand how reading evolved historically, how it is acquired by a child, and how it restructured its biological underpinnings in the brain, we can shed new light on our wondrous complexity as a literate species. This places in sharp relief what may happen next in the evolution of human intelligence and the choices we might face in shaping that future. This book consists of 3 areas of knowledge: the early history of how our species learned to read from the time of the Sumerians to Socrates, and those of you who do not know or remember that Socrates did not want us to read, there is a tale, futilely given then, but never more prescient than now. The middle of the book is the developmental life cycle. Juliana, where's the baby? The developmental life cycle begins in infancy and never stops. It never stops. My absolute favorite moment so far in the book tour was having, oh, please come, please, you come here.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to leave early to catch the commuter rail.
Oh, you know what? Grab that chair. Just grab that chair. I want everyone comfortable. You're to read and be comfortable. I was telling you my favorite moment last Friday night. The last thing I ever expected at a book reading was an entire huge row of women, the mean age of which had to be 85. And I went up to them and I said, "There is my favorite expert reading brain." Because we really are what we read. Everything. Oh, please, my dears, come in. This is so wonderful. My former students. It's so beautiful. Just find a place next to a book. But we are the cumulative. We are the cumulative sum of everything we read and think about. If I would show you an image of your brain, you would see yourself activate with all these associations, inferences. So it's just one physiological manifestation of the reality that Joseph Epstein said. We are what we read, or not. And that's where part of the cautionary tale about our children comes in. So the very middle of the book is looking from infancy all the way to the end of one part of our life. But the reading life, I would suggest to you, is an extraordinary resource. And last Friday night, these women came to me afterwards and said to me, "Oh, it's so wonderful, I have to say, to see some of my best friends." I'm not supposed to leave the mic. To see some of my best friends here. But they said to me, "You couldn't be more right. At this part of our life, nothing means more to us than all of our friends. And books are our friends." So this middle of the book is really from infancy all the way to the end of our life, the reading life. And then the third section of the book is potentially, is the dearest part to me. It's the story of dyslexia and some of the research that we know about a very, very different brain. About a brain so unique, we are only in the beginning of understanding it. And I will read to you a tiny little bit then. I've gone completely outside my text. You can see, however, that I know my own book. I'll end with this part in the summary of the 3 sections. Taken together, this cumulative knowledge about reading both celebrates the vastness of our accomplishment as the species that reads, records, and goes beyond what went before, and directs our attention to what is important to preserve. In much the way reading reflects the brain's capacity for going beyond the original design of its structures, it also reflects the reader's capacity to go beyond what is given by the text and the author. Going beyond, the time to think. These are the leitmotifs of this book. I'm going to give you one very short paragraph about what happens in a child's life who's just about on the cusp of becoming you, on the cusp of becoming what we call a fluent reader. But actually, because one of Shanti's daughters is here, I have to read one paragraph more, one paragraph extra, just for you, okay? Imagine the following scene. A small child sits in rapt attention on the lap of a beloved adult, listening to words that move like water, words that tell of fairies, dragons and giants in faraway places never before imagined. The young child's brain prepares to read far earlier than one might ever suspect and makes use of almost all the raw material of early childhood, every perception, concept, and word. It does so by learning how to use all the important structures that make up what is the brain's universal aspects of its reading circuitry. Along the way, the child incorporates many of the insights into written language that our species learned breakthrough by breakthrough through 2,000 years of history that stretch from the Sumerians to the first proto-alphabetic script. Now, I want you to just think for 1 second, and I look at Becky Kennedy, who worked with me on the origins of language once, a dear time to me. It took 2,000 years for us to discover for ourselves, piece by piece, the alphabetic principle. There are wonderful other forms of writing, but I'm just going to say 2,000 years it took us to figure out that alphabetic principle. Do you know how many days we give the child to uncover and discover for themselves? 2,000 days. 2,000 years the species took, and we give our children 2,000 days. But those days all began under the crook of an arm in the comfort of a loved one's lap. How a child first learns to read is a tale of either magic and fairies and dragons and princes, or missed chances and unnecessary loss. There are two scenarios of two very different childhoods. The first in which almost everything we hope for occurs, and the second in which few tales are told and little language is learned, and the child falls farther and farther behind before reading can even begin. And it is not coincidence that part of this book is about studies of children, and studies of children from different backgrounds. In one background, in one wonderful study, we have children who come from very privileged backgrounds, middle-class backgrounds, like everyone here. And it's not middle or lower class SES levels. It's what's available in those homes. That's what makes the difference. And the difference can be as many words as 32 million words different. There are children from privileged homes average homes who hear, we don't have that many words, it's instances of those words, but they hear words, 32 million more words than the children from less privileged homes. That's who walks in the kindergarten door. That's only 5 years. There is a chasm that's out there, and our teachers are extraordinary in what they must do when they see that chasm. But that's a chasm that doesn't need to be there, and we can change it. But that wasn't what I started to say. Every time I see people, especially my students, I want to say that, because these are things that we can change. But now I want to just give this one paragraph I was going to tell you about this young brain. Just look at that gorgeous child right there. It's her brain that I'm going to be reading to you about. The young, almost fluent, comprehending reader's brain is on the threshold of attaining the single most essential gift of the evolved reading brain: time. With its decoding processes almost automatic, the young fluent brain learns to integrate more metaphorical, inferential, analogical, affective background and experiential knowledge with every newly won millisecond. Once you know how to decode and you've got it down, you can allocate time to all of that stuff of who we are as thinkers. For the first time in reading development, the brain becomes fast enough to think and to feel differently. This gift of time is the physiological basis for our capacity to think, as Darwin said a little differently, endless thoughts most wonderful. Nothing is more important in the act of reading than this precious moment of time to think. Now, there are many expert reading brains in this audience, and I am so tempted, I desire more than anything to read you a little bit of Middlemarch, but I'm going to hold myself back. Those of you who walked up those stairs and saw Jane Austen continued, this part of the book is for you. It's about Dorothea, and it's about Mr. Casaubon. And for those, I look at Kathy Moritz, I can't help it. Kathy and I read Middlemarch 5 times, 6 times, maybe 7 times. And we always empathized with that idealistic Dorothea Brooke. But only in preparing for this book did I finally understand Mr. Casaubon, the supposedly crusty old researcher scholar. Those of you who haven't read the book, I mean Middlemarch, you read Middlemarch before mine. And it will enhance your experience. But I will actually read only one little tiny thing from Joseph Epstein and Hermann Hesse, and I will just ask you to read me later. But Joseph Epstein said, reading is experience. A biography of any literary person ought to deal at length with what he read and when, for in some real sense we are what we read. That's right. I love this. But now this is for us who decade after decade read anew what we thought we had read before but didn't understand. Every single layer. This is Hermann Hesse. For every thinking person, each verse of each poet will show a new and different face every few years, will awaken a different resonance. The great and mysterious thing about this reading experience is this: the more discriminatingly, the more sensitively, and the more associatively we learn to read, the more clearly we see every thought and every poem in its uniqueness, its individuality, and in its precise limitations. It's Proust all over. We bring to the text changes us. We change our interpretation of the text anew. It's the great reciprocal in the middle of the reading life. Now I want to say one or two things about the dyslexia section. Every section is like a child to me. I want to read a lot, and I only will give myself 3 minutes in each section. But I want you to know, you know so little about dyslexia. Oh, this is another symbol. You cannot believe that we are on the threshold of understanding the beauty, the complexity, the uniqueness of this brain. Thomas Edison, Leonardo da Vinci, Picasso, Rodin, Gaudi, Charles Schwab, James Neilman, Paul Orfa, I never say Kinko, Paul Orfalea, however he pronounces his name. And may I suggest, many of the CEOs in Silicon Valley and many of the people who manage your finances and your retirement funds, they're dyslexic. They're all dyslexic. Why? Why are so many talented people, so many creative people dyslexic? We don't know. We are the beginning of understanding how differently organized, for some, not for all, but how differently organized the brain of some of our children with dyslexia are. These brains have a story to tell. They were there before literacy began, and they are, in many ways, I believe, a key to the future. They're fresh evidence every day that our brain was never organized to read. This brain, the brain of my child, one of my children, this brain is making art, making cathedrals, seeing patterns, literally thinking differently. I'm not going to read to you more than one paragraph from that chapter, but I sure hope that you will love this one little paragraph. The single most important implication of research in dyslexia is not ensuring that we don't derail the development of a future Leonardo or Edison. It is making sure that we do not miss the potential of any child. Not all children with dyslexia have extraordinary talents, but every one of them has a unique potential that all too often in the past has gone unrealized because we don't know sufficiently how to tap it. We who work with these children seek to find methods that will help realize their potential. After all is said and done, the research on dyslexia, from behavior to gene, ultimately needs to connect what we know to what and how we teach, and whether it works or does not work for a particular child. We need teachers who understand the reading brain, who are trained to use a toolbox of principles that they can apply to different types of children. And now I come to the end of my book. And now I also come to a small section which has caused me a lot of mail. Email, voicemail, actual post mail. I even got a cartoon today from someone who was sending me a cartoon on basically why bother to read. You know, the cartoon, I don't know if you saw it in the Sunday paper. It was someone like Pogo, and he's trying to defend reading. And he says, well, this other guy says, give me one good reason. And he says, well, I'm reading, To Kill a Mockingbird. He says, not a problem. Opens up the computer, begins to read. So what's the difference? And this poor character at the end said, well, he couldn't think of anything. says, well, at least when I go to bed at night, I have my friends about me. And I thought, the person who sent it to me because of the paucity of reasons he thought there were to read a book. But he didn't know that's one of Proust's major thoughts about reading. Reading is an act, is a miraculous act, because in the midst of solitude, we are also in the midst of a communication. I am going to read to you one passage and then end the book, but I want you to realize that the book is trying to explore, on the basis of what we know about how precious reading is, what we might lose if full-heartedly we repeat one historical transition after another, where human beings seem to leap into the next, into the new, into the faster, into the better, into the blah, blah, blah. We, like Socrates before us, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the move quickly, not too quickly, but from oral to written culture happened, at least for Socrates, overnight. We have a moment right now to ask what Socrates asked about the formation of knowledge. What I'm going to read to you is not an argument against technology. 3/4 of this book is based on technology. I am no Luddite. I am a person interested in the formation of knowledge and the best ways of doing it. And this moment where we are poised, often without thinking, ready to go into the digital epoch, immersing ourselves totally in new forms of presentation of text, I am going to ask us, not myself, us, to think deliberately about the formation process of our children's reading brain. Let me read one passage. At the start of the book, I quoted the technology expert, Edward Tenner, who asked whether our new information technology would threaten the very intellect that created it. This book's questions are not quixotic efforts to prevent the spread of technology whose indisputable worth transforms all our lives. Tenner's concerns are the technological analog both of Socrates' concerns and of the issues about what the reading brain as we know it contributes to the intellectual formation of the species and the child. The question that emerges, therefore, is this: what would be lost to us if we replace the skills honed by the reading brain with those now being formed in our new generation of digital natives who sit transfixed without moving a physical or sometimes cognitive muscle, with all the knowledge that's immediately before them? I am not, and this is very important, for I have actually been so interestingly reviewed because some people are thinking I'm just curious, as yesterday's wonderful, lovely review said, I'm curious about the digital brain. I am very curious about the digital brain, but I'm very attached to the reading brain. I am extremely hopeful about their convergence, but I am extremely worried. And in fact, I even wrote an essay recently called The Reading Worrier. I am worried about the formation process. When I talk to you about those milliseconds that these young brains are just beginning to have to learn to think for themselves, I want that moment suspended long enough for them to learn how to think for themselves, to infer, to bring all kinds of associations of their own without being just given everything instantaneously and voluminously in this wonderful, absolutely wonderful Google universe. I believe it comes too soon. I believe what I want is not this anti-technology. There's nothing anti-technology about this book. But it is so important for us to think about the formation of our children's brains before they become immersed in an approach to knowledge in which they think with their fingertips it's all there. Socrates was so worried about reading because he thought the seeming permanence of print would delude the young learner into thinking they knew and had no, he didn't say that, knew something deeply when they had only decoded it. My worry, and those of you who've read this op-ed page, and I, for better or worse, I'm saying it, I'm worried about Socrates' nightmare in our children. I am worried they will be fantastic decoders, multitasking. But will they learn to go deeper, to infer, to bring everything they have? Will they learn that set towards knowledge? I'll end tonight, the reading, with my last paragraphs. And I always love to do this in a certain sense because it starts in sum. So you don't have to read the book. It's like, give me a half an hour and here it is. Richard, you won't sell any books if I really say that. But anyway, in sum, the natural history of reading development presents an exceedingly hopeful but also cautionary tale about reaching the highest and the deepest levels of reading. It's a magnificent, sometimes poignant, often humbling story that began thousands of years ago in cultures that are known to us only because some human ancestors had the daring and the neuronal plasticity to preserve their debts and their yearnings on tablets of clay and rolls of papyrus. Equally courageous, Socrates feared above all else that the semblance of truth conveyed by the seeming permanence of this written language would lead to the end of the search for true knowledge, and that this loss would mean the death of human virtue as we know it. Socrates never knew the secret at the heart of reading, the time it frees for the brain to have thoughts deeper than those that came before. Proust knew this secret, and we do. The mysterious, invisible gift of time to think beyond, is the reading brain's greatest achievement. These built-in milliseconds form the basis of our ability to propel knowledge, to ponder virtue, to articulate what was once inexpressible, which, when expressed, builds the next platform from which we dive below or soar above. That's it. Thank you. Now, the real last sentence is not that, but it's the favorite sentence in my whole book, and I will never read it publicly. Only those who are my gentle readers will read it. Now, Richard, this is the moment when we can open up, and I know we have a mic that if you have some questions or some comments, I once said I was afraid that I would become San Sebastian at these book readings, but so far everyone has been very polite. We will maintain that in Cambridge, please. This is my home. So please, comments, thoughts, thinking beyond, of course, is what I want you to do. What are some of your thoughts, questions? Yes.
I wondered whether the teaching of rhetoric in the past
Yes.
and the ability to memorize a great deal of poetry or
Yes.
whatever that has been lost. What kind of I mean, there were
It's a
people who
beautiful
thought
question.
that was a huge loss to sort
Yes.
of the ability to be philosophical and a lot of other things. I mean, I can't even do it justice, but you
Right.
get what I'm
Oh,
saying.
absolutely. Absolutely. I must tell you that I have thought long and hard about the transition from oral language and what was lost and what was gained in writing this book. And memory plays such a role in Socrates' arguments against reading, because he felt that our memory would be forever changed by reading. And for him, knowledge had to be internalized. One of the sections in the book in which I tell you a tiny anecdote I'm going to tell you now. My mother-in-law, one of my sons is here, a lot to know him, is an incredible woman. She's 87 years old, and she can recite Rilke, Auden. You cannot believe an occasion where some stanza entirely will come from her, or the dirtiest limericks known to man and woman. It's everything. And I once asked her, I was just astonished, Lotta, how did you do this? I ask my students all the time, and the number of students who have more than 10 memorized poems has gone down, down, down over the years. But I asked her, how did you do it? And she said something very poignant without no pathos at all. She just said, do you know, I never wanted to be in a situation, if I were ever put into a prison or a camp, where I could not retrieve out of my heart what I love best. And it gave me a sense of some of the stuff that we have potentially unnecessarily lost. And I know at Tufts, one of the things that is a great movement, very quiet in some ways, but not among us who are teaching, is the encouragement of rhetoric, the encouragement of speech. And when you think about how wonderful it is to be able to communicate with syntactic complexity, with things that don't end with, you know. I do that all the time myself, you know. But it is a tick, and it is a treasure when we ourselves show our love of oral and written language and digital language. I mean, one variation of your question on the other side is, and I've had this question, is, what do you think of text messaging? What has it done to the syntactic complexity of the essays of our children? Since my son is in the audience, I'm going to go very lightly on that one. Since he knows I am terrible at it, I hate you. Do you know, just you? To me, it's a symbol of everything that's wrong. It's a very quick symbol. I think there's something gained and something lost. What I ask for is intentionality. I ask for attention to oral language. I ask for attention to the reading brain. I ask for attention to the very best ways of using technology. My colleague David Rose and the members of CAST are doing things unbelievably important for every child with dyslexia and many other children with every kind of area of challenge. Technology is a fantastic thing, but we need deliberateness as we use it. But we need a special deliberateness as we think what our young are becoming. What is their approach? What is their way of thinking about knowledge? So, another question. Yes. Could we have a microphone there? Yes.
Good.
I love your hat.
Thank you very much.
Was it me or?
He has his hand
I
up.
am.
Oh, but if you want to afterwards. Yes.
Thank you very much for writing this very great book.
Oh,
I have the feeling that you have what it takes to be our American response to the Harry Potter series. Based on this very personal impression, please do you have some plans to begin to write a sequel to this very potential classic literary endeavor?
If you mean, do I have a sequel to this? I do. But it will be totally about dyslexia. And it will. I even have another title that's easier to understand. The Brain That Thinks Differently. That will be my book on dyslexia. As for writing Harry Potter, oh, I would love to do it. But I'm not gifted in that way. But there are those among you here who are. In fact, I just heard of a child with dyslexia who is 18 who has really written something that may be in that genre. But what I really take from your question is the importance of reading for our children and what Harry Potter has done. The New York Times called me when I was in Berlin, Motoko Rich, and said, what do you think, from a reading expert, people were saying this and that. I said, I love it. I mean, there have been essays, whole essays about the impoverishment of language because of Harry Potter. No, no, no. It is engaging our young. Let us engage them with books, things that they hold and think about and make them want to read more and more. If I could, I would write Harry Potter. I can't, but someone in here will, and I will be so happy. Oh, but those of you who haven't read it, I'm sure you have it, The Lightning Thief. Has anybody read that? By Rick Riordan, R-I-O-R-D-A-N? I can't believe it. It's all about a dyslexic hero who's like Harry Potter. But he uses, and he goes into this camp, and there's, he's feeling bad about himself. And they say, don't you realize your ADHD is poisoning you for battle? Your reflexes are honed. You have to see things this way because you can read. It's like he just uses all the stuff of what some people think is a problem. And what I love about the book is it shows how things that we misread as problems can be a source of strength if we would but know how to use it. And dyslexia is such an incredible area because, and certainly my dear colleagues who are from the Center for Reading and Language Research know, we are doing battle. And our interventions are based, and there will be many interventions. Ours is just the beginning. This Revue program is only the beginning. We are trying to take what we know and help our children with dyslexia or reading problems find themselves, endure the system, and find their moment when they can contribute, like Edison. And they don't have to be Edison to contribute. But by God, I don't want them contributing certain other ways. And I will say one other thing, and I'm just using you to associate. You know that. I just keep going until someone else raises their hand. So you please know that's what I'm doing. When I was in Phoenix, Arizona, something really horrible happened to me. A foundation took me to the Office of Prisons. And what I found out was truly horrific. In Arizona, and it's not the only state that does this, they estimate the prison beds that they will need by the number of children who are failing reading in 3rd grade. We can do better than that. Let's put the money, instead of the estimates of prison beds, let's start doing even better jobs. And our teachers are doing extraordinary jobs. But we can do better. And actually, I have to say to some people who are here, that is one of the major motivations for this book. I want this knowledge in the hands of everybody. It took so many years to write because at first it was a hybrid academic trade book. It's now, even though a few people think it's hard to read, it's not. You heard it. This is not hard. This is just beautiful stuff. She said humbly, oh my God, on public television. Sorry. Anyway, other questions? Yes, see, you did have a question.
So if we as a society are what we read, what do you make of the fact that the number of major investigative newspapers has shrunk to about 4, and at least in Boston, being replaced not only by USA Today, but the Boston Metro being replaced by Boston Now, which I think is mostly reader content posted on their website. Does that mean we as a society are stupider, and if so, what do we do about it?
There are 2 and 3 parts to your question, but I will comment on only 2. First, we'll dismiss. It's not a matter of stupider. You know what I think of that word. I rue the day that we are losing so many excellent papers and journals, and it's not that I don't want access. I just don't think we have to have these binary ways of dealing with information and its presentation, that it's either this or that. I really think there's room and need, and I think that's the more important, there's need for true investigative analyses that demand from us critical analysis and skills. And when you were playing with me and probably the audience by using the word stupider, but for me, I am very concerned that the amount of real probative analysis in our reading is going to be affected. And the amount of information we have is not the same as the depth with which we comprehend it, the depth with which we prioritize knowledge, the depth with which we connect it to all kinds of other kinds of knowledge. And technology and the presentation on, my husband is always looking at 3 or 4 newspapers online. That is a fantastic thing. It does not have to be negative. But I think it is negative if it means the demise of real investigative kinds of a press. I think that would be a horrible thing. So, there are 2 questions back there. There have been 2 men and 1 woman. So the next has to be a woman, and then the next will be a man.
Oh, can I still go?
Always be flexible first.
So I need a little clarification on what you meant by the brain having more time. Is that what you said?
Yes, good. You know, one of the hard things about any kind of reading is that you are reading something out of context that you have written. And I really wish I could have read to you a whole page just around that paragraph because it's essential. And so I'm going to show you, can I have the microphone? Where is that microphone? I'm going to show you on this gentleman's head because it's such a beautiful. Do you mind if I use your hand? Okay. I'm going to use this thing this way. We're just going to show you what the brain does with your question. So his eyes are picking up this information, going back to the occipital lobes. On his left hemisphere, he is a rapid decoder, so everything goes like this. Literally. You got it all together. He's decoded Proust and the squid, right? He's decoded. It's done. But now, as Richard said, what in the heck does that mean? If he spends precious milliseconds trying to figure out Proust, which most people say, Proust and squid, he has no time to activate what happens after decoding. After decoding, both hemispheres are becoming activated with all the inferences, associations, your affect, all the things that you know you are bringing to that decoded, just begun to be understood word or sentence. That time that happens after decoding is really the beginning of fluent comprehension. But it's the heart, the absolute heart of the reading process. The more you bring to it, all of this is happening. We can literally in our images see this happening. That's what you do with what you read. Anytime you read, it goes like to decode and then time to think. And we're only talking milliseconds. Literally, 200 milliseconds, you've got all this information. 400 milliseconds, you're bringing all the meaning, inference, all this stuff. Less than a second, less than half a second, you're bringing it all. But what if, I'll turn your question around. Oh, I know I'm not using the microphone. Oh, good. What if you don't decode that quickly? What if you are spending, as an adult, all your time decoding? We have to make sure our children and our readers of anything have a level of decoding fluency so they can learn to comprehend. So there's many parts to your question. And then there's the part, we want the brain so that it has a set towards comprehending, towards bringing its inference and its feeling and its association. So one of my worries, and maybe that's behind a part of your question, is that the kids are really going to be great decoders, but they won't have learned the way all of us read. They really are going to be a little different. And my MIT crew, where's Juliana? Did she have to go with the baby? Elizabeth, we have to study what's going on in certain children who really are not learning to read in that same way. I would like to study them. I know they're out there, that's for sure. And they're, I don't want to go there right now with my response, but I really want that brain to be able to bring all its riches and to have that as its set. That's the way it reads. Not just to have massive information, to have sidebars right here, and to have children in a state of, what is it they call, continuous partial attention. I do not believe that deep reading, which is what we are really after. I avoided the word deep written language or deep reading. Those of you who are Chomsky scholars, I'll look at you, Becky. Do not want to say that, deep structure. I don't want to say that. And yet, of course, that is in essence a little piece of what I'm saying. There is a deep kind of reading, a depth to it all. That's what we want. And we want the kids. We want those Ibsenian wild ducks. We want them after the bottom, not floating on the surface all the time with all this information. There's a poet who I quote, William Stafford, who said this more beautifully than I ever could. A quality of attention has been given you. That's what I want our readers to have, a quality of attention. Thank you for your question. Do you have a home in Plum Island by any chance? Jackie. Next question. Yes. Oh.
Do you think that we should be spending more time with children in terms of pre-reading activities, and that we are creating your serial decoders because we are asking children to be good readers at the end of kindergarten now as opposed to later?
Well, my colleague Kathy Moritz and I are going to be studying this over time. Not just that question, but a question writ large. There are two different points I want to make. The first point is a follow-up to yours, and the second one is quite different. The first one is, I really believe, along with my colleague David Elkine, that not only do we have a hurried child, we have a hurried reader. I don't know why every child has to have this horrible urgency placed on them unnaturally, and in terms of the brain, physiologically unnatural. Between 5 to 7 is the time across all cultures that we are learning to read. And the brain really, there's great research, and it's not finished. The research is not finished. But one of the major areas that a young child uses is called the angular gyrus. And if you want to think about it as an area that integrates things, the wonderful Boston neurologist Norman Geschwin said this many years ago, and I think there's increasing evidence about it, that myelination, how this area becomes developmentally ready to communicate with other areas, is not happening, especially in boys, till closer to 7. So that in some of our children, we are really unnaturally hurrying them up. Now, I have said that I think it's pedagogically and physiologically premature or unnecessary for us to speed. By the same, it's like the Goethe. I have twin souls here. The other side of me, it's not hurrying, but it's giving literacy and oral language experiences to all children. That I don't want to neglect. So I don't want to hurry everybody up into an unnatural pace. I want it as I've said that reading is not a natural act, and I really meant it. It needs, as Steve Pinker, the cognitive neuroscientist who has written so many books, said this much better than I could ever say it, but he said basically that reading is not programmed like language, but must be this is the quote, painstakingly bolted on. We've got a lot of work in reading. Children, this is hard work. And I just worry and ask why we have to assume that every child has to, by the end of kindergarten, or even worse, before kindergarten, be quote-unquote readers. There are some who read, Penelope Fitzgerald, Sartre. I mean, they read at 3 and 4, right? I certainly didn't. I did just fine at 7. No, but it's not that. It's not that at all. I don't want one more set of extra pressures on our parents, our teachers, or our children. That doesn't mean we don't give as much language and literacy experiences and help those who are readying to do what comes to them. But, as you heard me say about the 32 million words, my real worry is the children who come to kindergarten with no literacy exposure to materials, and sometimes languages in the home that are themselves not totally fluent. It's not just English language learners. Some of our children have no one language they're totally fluent in. There's all kinds of issues that are going on, and by the same token, some of our English language learners get all this rich experience in this other language, and they bring it, and then they learn English. They have all those concepts. They have all those words. That's fabulous. So I am putting many strands of chapters 4 and 5 in my response to you. But it is not a simple one. But it's a rich one. It's a rich story with many strands. Okay, I'm going to have one. You're my last question. I was supposed to end. Yes.
I'm not quite sure. I understand you have mixed feelings on the technology, but what do you think about, where young children are exposed to these computers, and they do most of their reading on the computer, and I understand that it's right there, bum, bum, bum. You don't really have time to think. You go right through. You're not physically going in there, and the same with the text message. You don't get any nuance, nothing. They would rather text than talk so that they don't have to read or perceive that. But, obviously there's tremendous benefits of having the computers there.
Absolutely.
but you don't get any of the, but I know most adults, there's so much information. You just keep on reading. It's very difficult to sit down and just read because there's so much coming. What do you think children should do? I mean, as far as computer usage during that age when they're doing that?
You know, I recognize your question is just perfect. It's a perfect way to end because I recognize I am giving this right back to the reader, to the parent, to society to answer. I know what my answer is. But I will tell you that deliberateness, intentionality, thoughtfulness about all of this is an absolute must. We must raise the question that you are asking across, not across the land, I don't want to exaggerate. We must, as a society, raise that question to true seriousness. I do not answer it in this book. I truly don't. I show you, like Moses, there's where the promised land is, but I don't go there. I leave it to you. And I will leave it to you tonight. Thank you so much for coming. That was
It's signing time.
Marianne Wolf teaches child development at Tufts University in Medford, Massachusetts. She spoke at the Harvard University Bookstore. For more events in Cambridge, Massachusetts, visit harvard.bkstore.com and click What's New.
If you never thought that reading about reading was your cup of tea, well, you may find that the way Marianne serves it up, it's not weak tea, but a pretty heady brew. Now, you take a look back yonder in the store, and you'll see that our once very modest cognitive science section is now bursting at the seams, full of itself, and ready to invade and colonize the shelf space of its nearest neighbors. The brain is big. Now, let others argue whether it's sexy to be brainy, but the brain itself, as a subject, is sexier than ever. All brains. If you read the Globe's review of Marianne's book yesterday, you probably also read a few pages earlier an article about the behavior of birds. Because yes, even bird brains, a term better used, it now seems, as a compliment than as a pejorative, are sexy today. You would think that with all the eons we've had in which to get used to it, the gray matter under our hats would be old hat by now. But these old brains of ours are like brand new toys, and boy, is it fun to learn how they work. Now, the mad scientists in the old Frankenstein movies were always feverishly looking for brains. But today's sane scientists, we'll be generous and give them the benefit of the doubt, are just as feverishly looking at them and finding out as much about our inner universe at long last as, thanks to the Hubble telescope, we are finding out at long last about the outer one. And Marianne, in her groundbreaking look at our reading brains, our evolving brains, brings whole cerebral galaxies dazzlingly to light. Marianne Wolf comes to us tonight all the way from down the street, 2 T-stops away, actually, where she is professor of child development and director for the Center of Reading and Language Research at Tufts, and where she holds the John DiBiagio Chair of Citizenship and Public Service. Her new book is a public service, and as a book about the delights of reading should be a true reading delight itself. This is science not as vegetables, this is science as dessert. Well, it's no less a delight to have Marianne join us here, so please now join me in giving her, on this brisk evening, a very warm welcome.
You can always tell when you are in the company of a true book lover. That was the introduction of a true one. Thank you so much, Richard. I want to first just thank everybody for coming. Some of you are dear, dear friends, and some of you are such new friends. It's a baby that I've never met from MIT, a dear friend, his baby, so I'm just thrilled. One What I'm going to do tonight is actually read to you, believe it or not. And I will inevitably step outside the book and talk to you about some of my thoughts. But I want to read to you certain sections because the book is in sections. And sometimes I feel like I just want you to do all the reading and me just to sit there and ask you questions. Because in fact, Richard, that's what Proust is really all about. And I'm going to read to you a section about Proust in just a minute, but lest there be too much of a mystery, Proust wrote a tiny little book called On Reading. And this book was given to me by one of the dearest people, the grande dame, really, of reading research is Jean Chaw, who taught at the convoluted recesses of the brain, studying their layers of meaning and form, and teaching their secrets to the young. In these pages, I invite you to ponder the profoundly creative quality at the heart of reading words. Nothing in our intellectual development should be less taken for granted at this moment in history as the transition to a digital culture accelerates its pace. This is particularly true because there also has never been a time when the complex beauty of the reading process stood more revealed, when the magnitude of its contributions was more clearly understood by science, or when these contributions seemed more in danger of being replaced by new forms of communication. Examining what we have and reflecting on what we want to preserve are the leitmotifs of these pages. In this book, I hope to push you gently towards reconsidering things you might have long taken for granted, such as how natural it seems for a child to learn to read. In the evolution of our brain's capacity to learn, the act of reading is not natural, with consequences both marvelous and tragic for many people, particularly children. Oddly enough, a preface often presents the author's final thoughts on finishing the book, and this book is no exception. But rather than end with my own words, I wish to use those that I...
Neuroscientist Marianne Wolf describes how the human brain learned to read only a few thousand years ago, and how reading has changed the way our brains work. Her talk from the Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts, is an hour 10 minutes.
Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Harvard Coop. You know, one of the pioneers of the French Surrealist movement described the surreal as being the chance encounter of an umbrella and a sewing machine on a dissecting table. Well, I have to wonder what he would have thought about the premeditated encounter of Proust and a squid, of all things, on the title of a book. I mean, Jules Verne and a squid, well, that's an obvious couple to find at the dance, right? But what, his often tentacularly entangling sentences aside, has Proust got to do with a beast of the deep? Well, that is a secret I will leave to tonight's guest to reveal. What is no longer a secret after just a few days following its publication is that behind Marianne Wolf's grabber of a title is a grabber of a book. Now, you know that some music begins with a lot of orchestral scene setting and throat cleaning and kind of slow muttering, marshalling of forces, and some begins with a cymbal crash. You might nod off later, but for the moment you sit up straight, all is, right? Well, Proust and the Squid starts off with just such a bang. A whole paragraph of bangs, actually. Marianne's way of serving notice, I think that she has something to say, and a good deal to say, and no time to beat around the bush in saying it. And in this case, the pace never slackens, and no, you won't nod off.
Harvard Reading Lab, and she gave me this book. She isn't alive today, but I will just dedicate tonight's whole wonderful experience to the memory of Jean Chaw. And in this book, Proust said something that I'm going to read to you, actually, to begin with. We feel quite truly that our wisdom begins where that of the author ends. And we would like to have him or her give us answers, while all he can do is give us desires. By a law which perhaps signifies that we can receive the truth from nobody, and that we must create it ourselves, that which is the end of their wisdom appears to us as but the beginning of ours. And that, gentle readers, is truly the heart of reading. And that is the reason why the very first word of the book is a reference to going beyond print itself through Proust. I want to begin, however, not with the symbols and the clash of the first chapter, which I will read a little bit from, but a quieter mood. And it's a bit of the preface. And I do not want that baby to leave. I want my time in Harvard Square to be with that beautiful child, because that's where it begins. That is going to be a genius baby, already going to book signings and book readings. That's our blessing. I have lived my life in the service of words, finding where they hide in the